Hey there, nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with another episode of Cheap Shots. This is a series that is dedicated to showing you how to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby. And on today's episode number 71, we're going to show you guys how to quickly as well as cheaply paint up a Nurgle's Rotters team for Games Workshop's Blood Bowl. So as you can see in this picture, this is exactly what your team will look like. As you can see, it's got a beautiful tabletop standard. It's very bright and bold and colorful, and this could all easily be yours for the simple low introductory rate of $45.31. That's how much it's going to cost, especially if you consider buying everything for the very first time. That's the most it's going to cost in order to paint up this team to this exact standard. And when you compare that to the materials that you must purchase from Games Workshop as well as from Army Painter, you're talking about a grand total savings of $203 as well as 24 cents. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. So with over $200 in savings, you can literally buy a starting box set of anything from Games Workshop with the amount of money you would save using our cheapskate method. Now, just a quick little information. The cheapskate method we use to paint with is a quick paint method, which means we only do base coating, dry brushing, and doing an oil wash. So if you're familiar with that painting technique, this will be very familiar to you because this is exactly the techniques that we're using. So that being said, let's get this video on a roll. Alright, so first of all, the first thing you need to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures as well as texture your bases. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this step is because I had a couple of viewers asking me exactly how I go about texturing my bases, and this is exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about texturing it. It's pretty simple. After I get done assembling the miniatures, the next thing I do is, of course, I add sand to their bases in order to create texture. My technique for doing this is actually really simple. All I do is I take the cheapest wood glue I can find, and I take an old paintbrush, I take the wood glue, and I cover the parts of the bases that I want textured with sand. And after I get done painting those bases with the wood glue, I then take the miniature and spoon some sand that I get from my backyard or my garden directly onto the base. That's all you're required to do in order to do texturing. The next step, of course, is to let it dry, and once the glue is dried and the sand is attached to the base, the next thing you want to do is to then seal it. The problem is a lot of people, when they do their own basing and they're doing their own texturing for their bases, they don't seal the materials that they use. So because it kind of flakes off over time, and make a mess of your miniatures. So what you need to do is you need to put a sealant on top of it, and the sealant that I use is actually really simple. All I do is I take wood glue as well as regular tap water. I mix the two of them together until it's about the viscosity of milk. I then take that same old paintbrush that I used to apply the wood glue on the bases, and I put that directly on top of the sand. When the wood glue dries with the water, basically what it does, it creates a tight seal that goes on top of the sand, so that way it doesn't go anywhere. And this is what your miniatures will look like if you decide to do that whole texturing system that I use for my bases. People I know like to buy different texture paints made by Games Workshop, by Army Painter. I mean, you could do that if you want to, if you got the money, but if you're looking for a real cost-saving way of doing this, this is the best way that I found to do so. Now, if you'll notice, my bases actually have some texturing on parts of the bases while the rest of the bases do not. And the reason why is because I'm going to make this kind of swampy bog-like effect that I use for all the Nurgle-themed miniatures in our studio's collection. And so I'm going to carry on with that same technique with this one. So because you can see some bare plastic still there, and that's because I'm going to add some goo and stuff like that in there to make it look like slimy, boggy wasteland look. So now that we're done assembling and basing your miniatures, the next thing to do now is to do a primer. So the next step, of course, is to prime your miniatures. In this case, I like to use Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. It's super cheap. I get it at my local Walmart for $3.99, and it's the preferred primer that I like to use. Primer is actually a very important step for miniatures painting because it does a couple of things. The first thing that primer does is it actually gives an uneven surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. If you were to paint your miniatures with bare plastic with no primer directly from the pot, what's going to end up happening is that the acrylic paint doesn't really have much of a surface tension to adhere to. So because of that, if you're not careful, you could just rub your miniatures with your thumb and you'll take the paint right off the miniature, ruining the finish on your miniatures. So you always want to prime your miniature to make sure that they're, microscopically speaking, there's a very rough texture with lots of surface tension, so that way your acrylic paints can stick to it. Another thing that priming also does too is that depending on what color you use to prime your miniatures will have a large effect on the vibrancy and the value of the colors that you put on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, if you use a white primer, you're looking for very bright or very bold color choices, and so it helps with the vibrancy of those colors. If you use a black primer, it kind of darkens down and mutes the value of the colors, so if you're looking for a darker color scheme, black is a good color to use. Now, of course, you could use gray if you want to. Gray is a nice medium between the two, and it's just going to have the same kind of effect on the vibrancy of your colors as well. Now, because we're doing a quick paint method on this system, what's going to end up happening is that the oil wash that we'll be using is going to mute down the value of the colors. So because of that, making bright, bold colors at the very first start of it, it's going to be very important because by the time we add the oil wash, it will darken it down. And that's the reason why I like to use a white primer. So the first thing we're going to paint real quick is the flesh on these miniatures. So oddly enough, for being a Chaos team, Nurgle miniatures have a lot of flesh being exposed, even though they're Chaos miniatures. Traditionally speaking, Chaos miniatures usually have a lot of armor, so you don't really see much flesh, especially if you're talking about Chaos Undivided or Zneach or Khorne, for example. Slaanesh and Nurgle, though, they got flesh showing quite a bit. So because of that, we got to take care of most of this because this actually covers most of the miniatures. Now, as you can see in this photo, I've actually taken the liberty of actually creating 3 different skin tones for my miniatures. As you can see, I took 3 Marauders. I basically painted them with 2 layers of taupe gray by Anita's acrylic. That's a nice kind of off gray kind of khaki color, and it's a perfect kind of like pale corpse type look that I'm really looking for painting up those guys. So I put 2 thin layers on all the flesh on that one. Another one I do, of course, is I also decided to take some of the team members and actually go for the darker skin tone as well. So because I use Nutmeg Brown by Apple Barrel Paint, you can find this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just put 2 thin layers on all the exposed flesh on one of my Pesticores, one of my Rotters, as well as one of the coins, as well as the turn markers, and I also put them on 2 of my bloaters as well. And then lastly, of course, I use Flesh by Apple Barrel Paint, cost 50 cents at your local Walmart, and I use that for the rest of the team, which is my last of my Pesticores, 2 of my bloaters, 2 of my Rotters, as well as my last turn marker, as well as the flip side of the Blood Bowl coin as well. I did this so that way I can create some variety of skin tones in the miniatures, and the reason why is because when you look at Blood Bowl miniatures, especially from Citadel, what ends up happening is that half the team is basically one set of sculpts is what it is. They have 6 sculpts that are used throughout the entire team, and then they duplicate that for the bodies for the other half of the team, and then the way you create differentiation between the different miniatures is by swapping out different heads. By using a range of skin tones like this in your miniatures, especially since so much of it is exposed, it's going to give the illusion that there's a lot more variety of sculpts going on in your Blood Bowl team, and that's the reason why I like doing that. You don't need to be particularly neat at this stage when it comes to painting the flesh. Just make sure you got a good even coverage and 2 coats on all the parts that are exposed for flesh, and we move on to our dry brush. Alright, the next thing we do now, of course, is to dry brush our miniatures. Now, in case you're not sure what dry brushing is, what dry brushing involves is that you take a paintbrush and you dip into a paint that you want to use to do the dry brushing with. You then take that brush and you wipe off the excess of it onto a paper towel or onto a napkin until there's barely any paint left onto the bristles. Now, the reason why you want to do this is because what ends up happening is you're going to take your paintbrush and you're literally going to dust the surface of your miniatures that you want to be dry brushed. What's going to happen is that the individual pigments of paint that's left on the brushes is going to adhere to the raised surfaces of the miniature, creating the illusion of depth. It's going to create highlights for the raised surfaces of your miniature, while the darker base coat that you put down earlier is going to stay in the recesses. It's going to create that sense of 3-dimensionality with shadows as well as highlighting. When it comes to dry brushing, you want to work in layers, because the reason why is because you could always add successive layers of brightness to your miniatures to whatever degree that you want, but it's very, very difficult to go back. In fact, if you want to go back to a darker tone, what you have to do is stop your dry brushing, or rebase the miniature, whatever base color you had before, and start the whole process over again. So be careful when you're doing your dry brushing, because sometimes you might get to a degree of lightness that you're not really looking for. So in this case, for my miniatures that I have with that taupe gray that I painted earlier, I dry brushed them with Antique White by Apple Barrel Paint. As for the miniatures that are painted with the Nutmeg Brown earlier, I then used Territorial Beige to do the dry brushing for those guys. And lastly, I used Peaches and Cream by Delta Ceramcoat for my flesh colored miniatures I used earlier. Now, for the Apple Barrel Paints, you can get this at your local Walmart for 50 cents, and for the Delta Ceramcoat, you can get this at Hobby Lobby for 65. And as you can see, we have some nice 3-dimensionality taking place here. Now, if you'll notice, the surface and the texture of the miniatures has kind of like this pastel-y kind of chalky look to them. If you're kind of concerned about that, don't be afraid of it, right? Trust it, it's all part of the process. Your miniatures are going to look very chalky by the time you get done. And the reason why is because we're doing a quick paint method. That's the side effect of using dry brushing. In our quick paint method, when we do our oil wash, it's going to take care of that texture, and it's going to blend our layers together, so that way it's not as chalky looking or as obvious, and it's all part of the process. So now that we're done with the dry brushing, next thing to do now, of course, is start working on the uniforms. So because we're kind of inspired by the box art that's available for these miniatures, you can see the box in the background, I decided to kind of stick with the orange kind of uniform that they got going on with this team. So in this case, I use Ripe Tomato by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 50 cents at your local Walmart, and as you can see, I start painting both 2 layers of this stuff all over their trousers, their gloves, the bits of uniform they still have left on them as well. Now, traditionally, I do like to alternate colors when it comes to uniforms, so that way there's some variety of sculpts. However, I didn't have a different shade of orange to use for my team, and I really didn't feel like going to Walmart to go get some more, because let's face it, who wants to do that in their free time if they don't have to? So because of that, I just stick with the Ripe Tomato. Besides, the different skin tones are enough already to create the illusion of diversity, especially when I start painting the different shades of green they're going to use for their armor as well, which is really going to help out. So keeping the uniform fabric is not that bad. All you got to do is to use 2 thin layers of Ripe Tomato for all the fabric, and then from there you're ready for a dry brush. Alright, so the next color I like to use is Coral Shell by Americana. You can get this stuff at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. It's a nice kind of coral shell color, really pastel orange. I take this, I put in my brush, and I do a dry brush all over the entirety of the portions of the uniform that are orange. As you can see, that coral shell does a good job of catching the various surfaces and creating depth, especially around the knuckles and the fingers of the gloves that these guys are wearing. Also in the folds of the fabric as well. It does a beautiful job at the same time. And what you do is, all you need to do is just bring your dry brushing for coral shell to the degree of brightness that you want, and then once you're done, you're ready to move on to the rest of the armor. Alright, so this next part's going to be about the armor, and to add the illusion of diversity in the miniatures, what I decided to do is to paint different parts of the team and their armor different shades of green, and I did 2 thin base coats of each of the colors you see here. So for the Blood Bowl coins with the Nurgle symbol in the back, as well as two of my bloaters, I decided to paint their armor up in 2 thin layers of palm leaf, is what I decided to use for that one as well. At the same time, the same thing with the wrist guards of both turn markers too. It's a nice kind of bright olive green color, and it has a really nice finish to it. I use this color quite a bit before it comes to all of my Nurgle and Death Guard themed miniatures. After that, I then take the other 2 bloaters and I paint that with 2 thin layers of Holly Branch by Apple Barrel paint. It's a nice kind of bright Christmas green, and at the same time it looks really, really vibrant against the armor panels that they have there. And then lastly, for my 2 Pestigors, I decided to paint those guys up with 2 thin layers of English Ivy green, and that also comes from Apple Barrel paint. Now all 3 of these paints are available at your local Walmart for about 50 cents, and I just put 2 thin layers of this paint over all the parts that I want to be green. So for example, the Pestigors, I did it for like one of their antlers that are really messed up, as well as their one shoulder pad to give them kind of like a darker green color. I did exactly the same thing for the armor panels on the 2 bloaters with holly green, and the same thing with the palm leaf green for the bloaters, the coins, and the turn markers. And you have to be kind of neat at this point, just because you want to spill over and actually get into the actual flesh. If you do make that mistake, just neaten up with the base coats that you had from the previous. So moving on to our rotters, I actually picked out the details in 2 different shades of green as well. I'm pretty much focusing on the cancerous growths that are on the legs of 2 of the rotters, as well as the strips of jersey that they have for their chest for the other 4 rotters. So in this case, I used 2 different colors. I used Kiwi by Apple Barrel Paint, as well as Wintergreen by Apple Barrel Paint. Both these colors are available at your guys' local Walmart for 50 cents. I just put 2 thin layers of this paint on the parts that I wanted to be green for the uniforms, as well as for the tumors that are growing on the legs of these miniatures as well. And as you can see, it's got a nice kind of vibrant bright green, almost to the point where it's almost like a day-glow yellow for the Kiwi paint. So it does a really nice job there. At the same time, the wintergreen has this nice kind of minty spearmint look. At the same time, it looks kind of off-putting as well, but it contrasts nicely with the orange. And the best part about it is it's a Nurgle miniature, so it kind of fits in that whole theme as well. So now that we're done talking about the jerseys as well as the cancerous growths, next thing we need to do now is paint these guys' armor panels. So once again, I use alternating colors for this one as well. For the team that I actually painted with Kiwi for the cancerous growth and the tatters of their shirts, I actually painted their armor panels in 2 thin layers of wintergreen to create that diversity of green. At the same time, for the ones that I use wintergreen for the cancerous growth and jerseys, I used 10 thin layers of crisp apple green from Apple Barrel Paint as well. And of course, you can get the crisp apple green from your local Walmart for 50 cents. I just put 2 thin layers on all the armor, and as you can see, there's a great variety of different shades of green that's being used in all the miniatures. That's going to help create the illusion of diversity within the sculpts of your team as well, and it's going to have a really nice overall effect for your team. So now that all the armor panels are painted, the next thing we need to do, of course, is a dry brush. In this case, I decided to use Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 50 cents. And once again, I just do a quick dry brushing on all the armor panels I just painted with the green. I do the back of the Blood Bowl coins, the backs of the turn markers. I also do all the armor panels I just paint up for every single one of the players. And as you can see, it creates that beautiful highlighting effect with the darker colors stuck in the recesses as well. And as you can see, just from the different shades of green that we used alone, as well as the skin tones, it does trick the mind's eye into thinking that there's a lot more diversity going on in the terms of the types of miniatures that make up this team. So now that we're done working on the Lime Sherbet as well as the green armor panels, next thing you start working on now are some smaller details. So for this next step, I'm focusing on the turn markers as well as the Pestigors as well as the rotters that have spines sticking out of their body. And the reason why is because I'm going to take out those details using Khaki by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. I use the Khaki paint for the nails of the hands of the turn markers on the left hand side. I also use it for the horns as well as the hooves of the Pestigors, as well as the spines that are growing out of the backs of the 2 rotters in the team as well. I just put 2 thin layers of the Khaki paint, and then from there, ready to move on to some more spiner details. So for this next step, we're going to be focusing on our bloaters. In this case, I am focusing on the leather goods of the bloaters as well. So because we talked about the lack of diversity in terms of the sculpts, what I like to do is I like to alternate colors for different small details like leather goods, for example. Now for the two bloaters on the left-hand side, as you can see, I got one with holly green armor and another one with palm leaf armor. I paint their leather goods using burnt umber by Apple Barrel Paint. That's a nice chocolate brown color. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I use that on the bloaters with the signs stuck to the back of their shoulders as well as their boots as well. And then finally on the right hand side for those guys, I also use pavement as well. I use pavement paint for that one. Pavement paint's kind of like a really dark gray to the point where it's almost black, but the nice thing about pavement paint is that it has a nice like gritty texture to it. So when you do dry brushing, it does a really good job of catching those raised surfaces. And once you get done painting those leather goods as well as the signs on the shoulders of the bloaters, the next thing you do of course is a dry brush. Now for the dry brushing that I use on this one, I use Pale Gray by Folk Art for both the parts that I did in Burnt Umber as well as in the parts I did in Pavement. And the reason why is because that Pale Gray is going to do a nice job on the Burnt Umber, make it look like it's dusty and chipped wood for the signs, as well as dusty on the boots that they're wearing, and exactly the same thing on the guys who've done in Pavement as well. Just do a really quick once over with the dry brushing with the Pale Gray, and then from there we're ready to move on to our next set of details. So moving on to our next step, the next we're going to be focusing now are on the sneakers that all the players are wearing, as well as some smaller details. Now if you notice, I like to use two different colors for this, and these two colors have been popping up in a lot of the teams I've been painting up for our Blood Bowl campaign. I use Bright Blue by Apple Barrel Paint, runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart, as well as Anita's True Acrylic, True Red, that you can get that at your local Hobby Lobby for 65 cents. Now I had a viewer ask me, why do I use the blue and the red paint to divide the team even further? The reason why is because the very first time that we actually played Blood Bowl, my fellow players and I had a really hard time differentiating our different players. It was a huge problem, because we didn't have numbers on them at first when we tried to play, so we just tried to do it by memory, and there wasn't enough distinguishing characteristics of each of the models for us to remember each one. So when this second set around, because we have so many teams playing on this one, to help my fellow players to be able to differentiate the other players, what I did is I take half the team, I paint little small accent pieces blue, the other half in red as well. So that way that kind of adds to the differentiation of miniatures, so that way they can easily identify different players. And that's the reason why I use these accent colors. And I've been using for every single set of team members that we've been playing since I've been painting them up for our upcoming Blood Bowl League. Now, both these paints are really simple. Just put two thin layers on all the sneakers of the Marauders, as well as any of the small details on the positional players. So for example, on the Pessigor, he's got like strips of fabric with bells hanging from his antler. So because I paint those strips of fabric in blue. For the bloater on the left-hand side with the sign, he has cloth wrappings around his wrist as well as his ankles, so I picked those in two thin layers there. Or the turn markers, I take out the stitching inside of the fist with exactly the same thing. At the same time, I look for any stitching on the trouser, do exactly the same thing, picking out those details in bright blue. I do exactly the same thing for the other half of the team in Anita's True Acrylic Red. It's a really nice vibrant red, just put two thin layers on it, and then it's going to be done with this detail. After you're done with that, next thing you do, of course, is a dry brush. And once again, we go back to using Pale Gray by Folk Art, and the reason why is because it's a nice kind of dusty kind of gray, and I'll make this impression that their sneakers are all kind of dusty and worn and stained up with different things. So because of that, for all the elements I did in Bright Blue as well as True Red, I just picked those out in real quick dry brush of Pale Gray, and then from there, we actually have most of the miniatures done. What we now need to work on now are smaller fine details and add some things like pustules and wounds and all that kind of fun stuff. Alright, so the next thing we need to do now is start working on purple. And the reason why is because on the Blood Bowl emblem on the back of the Blood Bowl coin, according to the box art, it's painted a dark purple, and same thing with all the rents and the skin and the affected flesh of the bloaters. So for this color, I like to use Wild Iris by Apple Barrel Paint. Now for the back of the Blood Bowl coins, I put two thin layers of Wild Iris within the background of the back of the coins, so that way it has a nice vibrant finish. Now as for the bloaters though, I only put one thin layer of Wild Iris, and the reason why is because yes, some of the flesh is poking through the purple, but that's perfectly fine because I want to give the impression that the skin is bruised, not that they have like this splotch of purple that's on them all of a sudden. At the same time, when we get done dry brushing these with the different successive colors, it's not going to make much of a difference anyways if the skin is showing through, because it's going to look like just infected flesh is all that's going to happen there. So the next step, of course, is now that we get done with all the Wild Iris, next thing you do is a quick dry brush. In this case, we use Lilac Mist by Apple Barrel Paint, and it's a nice lavender purple color. It does a beautiful job with dry brushing, in my opinion. Just did a quick dry brush on all the parts that we painted earlier with Wild Iris. As you can see, it's catching the raised surfaces, leaving that darker purple in the recesses, and it's making the skin look very, very infected and really messed up, which is absolutely perfect because that's exactly what you want to look for when it comes to your miniatures from Nurgle. And I do exactly the same thing with the dry brushing onto the backs of the coins to raise that and catch that that textured surface that's on the back of the coin. Now the next detail I focus on next are the black shoulder straps that make up a lot of these miniatures. Now these Nurgling miniatures have like crossing belts that crisscross their bodies. They also have like straps that go underneath their armpits to hold their pauldrons on as well. For this case, I just use Accent Black by Apple Barrel Paint. It's just a typical black color. And I'm not going to dry brush it or do anything extra with it. And the reason why is because that black color just kind of works on its own, especially if you do the oil washing. It just kind of sticks out on its own. So there's not really much need to do any dry brushing with that at all whatsoever. And plus it kind of breaks up the different pieces of color that we have on these miniatures too. So now that we're done with that step, next thing we do now is start working on some more details. Now the next thing we're going to work on real quick are the rotters, and in this case we're looking at the tentacles that are actually growing out of these guys. It's actually a really neat design element that you've been seeing out of the recent Death Guard and Nurgle themed sculpts that have been coming out of Games Workshop, this sense of tentacles spreading out the backs and armpits and stuff, different miniatures. And so in this case the rotters have this. To pick out those tentacles, the only thing I need to use is Bright Magenta by Apple Barrel Paint. It runs you about 50 cents at your local Walmart. Just put 2 thin layers on all the tentacle appendages that are growing out of these guys for some really truly creepy looking Lovecraftian type design elements. So now that we're done with the bright magenta, the next thing to do now, of course, is to dry brush. In this case, I use Cameo Pink by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice cotton candy pink color, and it costs 50 cents at your local Walmart. Not only am I dry brushing the tentacles around the rotters, at the same time, I'm also dry brushing the infected flesh of the bloaters for the team as well. So that way, it just kind of adds another level of brightness, another level of disgusting detail onto those injuries and those infected flesh, and it looks really, really awesome in my opinion at exactly the same time. So the next detail we need to work on now is on all the pustules. That word is just so horrible to say that word. But these miniatures are covered with a bunch of pock marks as well as giant pimples and pustules and boils and all kinds of horribly disgusting things. So because of that, in order to add some variety to the sculpts that we're using, I decided to once again divide and use 2 different colors. For the team members that are done with red for their accent detail piece, I decided to pick out all their pustules in 2 thin layers of Kiwi by Apple Barrel Paint. And for the ones that use the blue accent pieces for the other half of the team, I use King's Gold by Apple Barrel Paint as well for theirs. And both these colors are available at Walmart for 50 cents. And I just picked out those boils and pustules in just 2 thin layers of both colors. That way they look really infected and look really nasty and look like they're about to explode in a rainfire of pus and grime and all kinds of infected nastiness. Now for these next few slides, what I'm going to be focusing on are on the accessories in the miniatures. I'll be focusing primarily on the turn markers as well as the coins. So for the turn markers, as you can see in this photo, the next thing I do, of course, is to work on the metallics. I use Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art as well as Pure Gold by Folk Art. You can get these products at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart for about 75 cents. I use the Gunmetal Gray to pick out the Nurgle emblem that's on the back wrist guards of these turn markers, and then I use the Pure Gold to accent the Chaos arrows that are pointing on the opposite corners as well. And the last thing, of course, I do is I take Kiwi by Apple Barrel Paint and I just put a dot of that stuff and inside of each of the different Nurgle, the dots of the Nurgle emblem, to make it look like the Nurgle emblem is actually rotted and oozing as well. So now what I'm going to do now is start focusing on the details of the coins. In this case, I am picking out the football emblem on the Blood Bowl symbol that's on the back of the coins. I just picked that out 2 thin layers of Territorial Beige. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And all I do is just put 2 thin layers in order to get a good final brown finish on that football icon. The next thing I do, of course, is I start painting up one of the straps on the football as well as the upper left-hand corner B in the Blood Bowl emblem. I picked out 2 thin layers of Ripe Tomato by Apple Barrel Paint. This is the same orange color that we use for all the trousers as well as the uniforms of the Nurgle's Rotter team members as well. Just put 2 thin layers on that. We're ready to move on to our next accent color. And that accent color that I'm using, of course, is Palm Leaf by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. Once again, I put 2 thin layers on the upper right-hand corner strap of the football, as well as the bottom right-hand corner B on the back of the coin as well. I just do 2 thin layers of that stuff. I don't bother dry brushing these details just because, yeah, I don't really need to at that point. And plus, when I do my oil washing, it's going to do some really detailed work on that anyways. So the next thing we work on, of course, is on all the metallic colors. I forgot to take a photo of it earlier, but I did pick out the little Chaos arrows using Pure Gold by Folk Art on the Nurgle emblem on the back of the coins. At the same time, I also used Copper by Folk Art in order to paint the rim of the Blood Bowl coins, as well as the bells hanging from the antlers of the Pessigors in the team as well. I just put 2 thin layers of Copper by Folk Art, cost you about 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart. And the next thing you do now is to weather these copper pieces with a dry brush. So to make the copper look rusty and aged, what I decided to do real quick is to do a dry brush. Now this is very important. When you do the dry brushing on this, you got to work very lightly and in layers, okay, because you don't want to overwhelm the copper color with too much oxidation. In this case, I use Tahitian Blue by Delta Cerncoat. It costs 60 cents, 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. All I did is I just took this stuff, just did a quick dry brush all over the copper pieces. Actually, I think I did 2 passes with my dry brushing, so that way there's a little bit of oxidation. I didn't want to add too much to overpower the copper color, but just enough, a still enough effect where you can see that it's kind of weathered and worn as well. Alright, then one of the final last pieces of detail work we need to do before we move on to the italics are the eyes. So when it comes to this team, for most of the team, which are the Rotters as well as the Pessigors, they're the only members of the team that actually have exposed eyes, in which case I just picked out 2 thin dots of Sky Blue by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just found all the eyes that were exposed, just put a little dot on there twice for 2 layers to get that kind of creepy, kind of glowing blue effect. And finally, the very last step is to work on the metallic elements of the team as well. So in this case, I use 2 colors to pick out all the metallic elements. I use Pure Gold by Folk Art as well as Gunmetal Gray. Now, when it comes to the armor panels of these guys, according to the box art that you see, they actually rimmed the armor panels with silver is what they use. I think they use lead belcher is what they use for theirs. But for me though, I wanted these guys to kind of match up with the Death Guard miniatures that I've painted so far in my studio. So because of that, I decided to go with that golden color for that classic Death Guard 40k look. So in this case, I just picked out all the trim of the armor and 2 thin layers of pure gold. As you can see, it looks very vibrant, and it kind of contrasts nicely with the green armor panels. Same thing with any of the Nurgle symbols that are on the armor panels as well. So these guys have Nurgle emblems on their shoulder pads or on the backs of their armor panels, in which case I just picked out 2 thin layers of pure gold. At the same time, I also decided to pick out some of the finer details with Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. So things like spikes, face grills, nails that are sticking out of their bodies as well, buckles on belts, face guards, all these kind of things. So whatever elements I want to be silver, I just picked out 2 thin layers of Gunmetal Gray. And whether you believe it or not, we're actually all done with these guys. The next thing you need to know now is start working on the bases. So for the bases on this one, for all the texturing that I have on the bases, I picked out one single layer of pavement paint by Apple Barrel Paint. And the reason why is because I'm going to go for this kind of scorched wasteland look that I use for all of our Chaos miniatures for our studio's collection. So because I just put a single layer of that pavement down, like I said, it's got a nice gritty texture, so when we dry brush, it's going to do a really good job. Now you might be wondering, well, Commander Cheapskate, by putting a single layer of pavement paint, won't some of the white undercoat bleed through the pavement paint? Yes, it actually will, but not to worry. And the reason why is because when we get done dry brushing it all that white that's peeking through is going to go away. No problem whatsoever. So the first color we use in order to do our dry brushing is with Burnt Sienna by Folk Art. It costs you about 75 cents at your local Walmart or Hobby Lobby. And as you can see, we're going to do a really heavy dry brush with that, meaning that we're going to go really focused, put a bunch of different layers on this real heavily with the dry brushing on the pavement paint. So as you can see, if there was any white showing through the undercoat, it is completely gone now because we've done our dry brushing with the Burnt Sienna. It kind of gives like this muddy, kind of scorched wasteland look that I'm looking for on the bases from these miniatures. But we need to do one more accent color with another dry brush in order to finally make that effect. And the color that we use once again is Terracotta by Folk Art. We're going to do about 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby or your Walmart. And because of that, just do a quick dry brush now with the Terracotta paint on top of the Burnt Sienna. So like I said before, if there was any white that was showing through our first layer of pavement, it is now completely gone because it's gone through 2 successive layers of dry brushing at this point. As you can see, the Terracotta as well as the Burnt Umber has caught the raised surfaces of the gravel of the texturing, and at the same time leaving that beautifully dark pavement color in the recesses in the miniature. So now that we're done dry brushing and painting the texture on the bases, and we're pretty much done with all the details of our miniatures, next we need to do now, of course, is an oil wash. So the next step, ladies and gentlemen, is to do an oil wash, and the reason why is because this is a quick paint method. In a quick paint method, all you need to do is do base coats and dry brushes, and then you do your oil washing as the wash stage for the entirety of the miniature. In this case, I like to use mid-wax polyacrylic. I like to use Mission Oak colors. I like to use polyshades, or not polyacrylic, polyshades in Mission Oak color. And the reason why is because it does exactly the same job as Army Painter. A lot of people like to use Army Painter Strong Tone or Army Painter Soft Tone in order to do quick paint methods, and that's perfectly fine. It's a wonderful product, does exactly as advertised. However, Army Painter Strong Tone and Soft Tone cost $32 per can, while a can of mid-wax poly shades costs $6.99 at your local Walmart. All you need to do is cut it with some paint thinner if you want to make it brighter, and that's exactly what I decided to do for these miniatures real quick. So as you can see, I do an all over wash with the Minwax poly shade, and as you can see, the oil wash does a couple things. The first thing that it does is that the oil wash creeps into the recesses of the miniature and actually stains it with that Minwax Mission Oak stain. And what that does, it brings a lot of the details that we didn't see earlier. So because of these miniatures have a lot of depth now because that oil washes in the recesses. The second thing it does as well is that it also smooths out the transitions between our dry brushes as well as our base coats. So if you notice, that pastel chalky texture that these miniatures had earlier is now completely gone. And the reason why is because that texturing is taking care of that for us and actually smooth out those transitions, which makes it really, really awesome. And the last thing it does as well, as you notice, it actually darkened down the vibrancy and the value of the colors that we put in these miniatures. And that's the reason why we use such bright, bold colors in the earlier stages, because this oil wash is going to mute it down pretty significantly. And so, as you can see here, this is what they'll look like. Now, after you get done doing your oil wash, you do need to wait 24 hours for the stuff to dry as well as cure. In fact, my recommendation to you, if you paint like on a regular basis, my suggestion to you is you make this oil wash the very last step of your painting for whenever you do it, and then wait 24 hours later to come back to it again, because by that point it will dry. And the reason why is because there is polyurethane in the stain, so if you have to let 24 hours cure, otherwise if you handle these miniatures while it's still kind of tacky, you could actually remove the actual stain and the paint beneath it right off the miniature, and it'll ruin your overall finish. And the reason why I know this is because I've done that before. So please wait 24 hours. It's well worth the wait. Now when it does dry, the polyurethane will harden and as well as cure, and it's going to create a protective layer in the miniature, which is kind of nice. But at the same time though, it's going to give us this high gloss finish. If you're a fan of that candy coated finish, you can skip this next step. I, however, am not. So because of that, the next step I'm going to take is a spray varnish. So in this step, this was just completely optional. You can get a can of matte spray and then spray your miniatures down, which I've done. I like to use Krylon matte varnish spray. It costs $5.99 at my local Walmart. And as you can see, it mutes down a lot of the sheen that we seen earlier from the polyurethane, from the poly shades on this one. By doing that, by getting rid of that high gloss sheen, you can actually see a lot of the details that you couldn't see before. You can see the stain in the recesses, the dry brushing with the highlighting and the base coating. It looks absolutely fantastic. So now that we're done with the matte finish, the next thing to do now is to finish up our bases by painting it to make it look like a toxic waste and infected bog. So the next thing we need to do, of course, is use Kiwi by Apple Barrel Paint. This is the same paint that we used before, and we just put 2 thin layers of this stuff all over the parts of the miniature, the bases that are not textured. Now the reason why we do this is because we want to create this kind of toxic, infected bog, slimy swamp thing that they're walking through. That's the only way I can explain it. Now, we do use 2 thin layers of Kiwi, but some of you might be wondering, well, Commander Cheapskate, won't some of the darker color kind of bleed through before from the stain? And the answer is yes, it will, but it's not a big deal. And the reason why is because we're going to put we're going to make our own homemade Nurgle's rot for that I like to use for our Nurgle miniatures, and we're going to paint over the Kiwi with that. And what that's going to do is that it's going to look like there's like natural dark splotches inside the toxic ooze, so it's only going to add the effect that this stuff is slimy and nasty and contaminated with all kinds of who knows what. So once you get done with the Kiwi paint, the next thing to do now is make our homemade Nurgle's rot. Alright, so the next step, of course, is to work on our Nurgle rot effect. In this case, I like to use Minwax polyacrylic in a high gloss finish. I like to mix that up with my New Amsterdam ink using the bright olive green colors I like to use for that one. All you need to do, of course, is do a 50-50 mix. Just make equal parts polyacrylic with the Amsterdam ink, and it's going to create your homemade Nurgle rot effect. Now, granted, you could, of course, buy Nurgle's rot from Games Workshop if you so feel. The difference, though, is that with this method, though, we can make a lot of it, and we can make as much as we need to the point where we could actually cover entire bases with this stuff, as well as all the nasty pustules and sores and anything else I want to cover with this stuff. Now for me though, I'm going to just use this directly onto the bases. So once I make my homemade Nurgle's rot, I just paint it right over all the portions I did in Kiwi. I do allow some of this stuff to spill over into the texture to make it look like it's kind of seeping into this toxic ooze to make it look more nasty. And then once we're done with that, next thing to do, of course, is to rim our bases. So the next thing we need to do, of course, is to rim the bases. In this case, I like to use 2 thin coats of Palm Leaf, once again by Apple Barrel Paint. This is the same color I've been using for all of the rimming of all the bases of our miniatures in our Blood Bowl collection, so I just kept on doing that as well just to create this look. Typically, whenever I paint Nurgle miniatures like this, I like to use burnt sienna on the rims of the bases, but these guys aren't really being used for Warhammer or for anything like that, so I'll be using this strictly for Blood Bowl, so that's the reason why I put the Palm Leaf on them. And actually, once you are done with that rimming of the bases, we are actually finished with our paint job. And once again, this is what the end result is going to look like by using our Cheapskate method. As you can see, we used a whole bunch of cheap craft paint to paint up these guys to a beautiful tabletop standard. We even made our own homemade technical paints using polyacrylic as well as ink, and it has a wonderful, wonderful job. And as you can see here, it saved you a bunch of money, over $200 worth at the same time. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about exactly the items you need to purchase from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you wanted to paint up our miniatures exactly the same way we did, but from the name brand companies. So with that being said, let's go and talk about what you'll need to buy from Citadel and Army Painter. So below is the shopping list that you'll need to get from Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to paint up your miniatures exactly the same way we did, but by using their products. First of all, you need to do a basing of Sterling Mud by Games Workshop to create the texturing for the bases. That's going to cost you $7.80. You'll then need to prime the miniatures in Corax White Spray. That's going to cost you $17 for that one. Now for the miniatures that have a pale flesh tone, you're going to use Wraithbone in order to create that effect. That's going to cost you $4.55 for that. You'll then need to purchase Averland Sunset for all the yellow details, which is also going to cost you $4.55. You'll then need to buy a pot of Nagarath Night for all the purple elements, as well as Vulcan Green for the armor panels, as well as Fulgrim Pink to do dry brushing. Same thing with Takala Lilac for all the dry brushing on the purple as well as pink elements of the miniatures. For all the miniature purchases that we did in black, you'll need to buy a Bat in Black, as well as use Teclis Blue for all the different blue elements that you put on the miniatures as well. You also need to buy Caliban Green, Screamer Pink, as well as Cyberite Green for all the armor panels that we did earlier. At the same time, you need to also buy a pot of Blue Horror for those sky blue elements that we did for the eyes. Now, all those paints I just talked about earlier, each one's costing you $4.55 a piece for those. Now then, for the burnt umber effects that we used earlier, you'll need to use Wildwood. It's going to cost you $7.80 for that. And as for the dark as well as the light skin tones, you'll need to buy Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone. Both those run you $4.55 at your local Games Workshop. Now, once we get done with that, the next thing to do is now pick out all the things that we've done for like the teeth and the fangs. You got to use Balar Brown, which costs $4.55. We're also going to need Gauss Blaster Green for all the winter green elements that we've done earlier for the armor panels as well. Same thing with Hellion Green as well as Moot Green. Those all cost you $4.55. Now, for the elements that we did in payment, you'll need to buy a pot of Asian Gray, which costs you $4.55 for that, as well as a pot of Troll Slayer Orange for all the uniforms that we've done earlier, and then you'll need a dry brush that with Lucaneth Orange, which also will cost you $4.55. You also need to use Flayed One Flesh in order to do the dry brushing for the flesh, also runs you $4.55 for that color as well. Now for the oxidation effect that we did on the miniatures for the copper tones, you'll need to use Nylok Oxide, which is a tentacle paint, runs you $4.55 for that, and then of course once again you'll need to buy a pot of Rakarth Flesh in order to do the flesh tones for the pale miniatures, 12 flesh miniatures, that runs you $4.55 for those. Now for the metallic elements, for the silver pieces you'll need to buy Lead Belcher, for the golden pieces you'll need to buy Retributor Armor, and for the copper pieces you'll need to buy Screaming Bell. All three of those run you $7.80 per pot for those. Now as for the bases, you'll need to base them in Dual Burl Brown, which runs you $4.55, and dry brush that with $4.55, but Squig Orange. And then lastly, you're going to use Ulthuan Gray. Ulthuan Gray is the use for the dry brushing for all the black elements, that runs you $4.55 for that. Now since you're doing a quick paint method, you'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which runs you $32 for that product. And of course, if you want to do the Nurgle's Rot effect like we do, you'll need to buy a pot of Nurgle's Rot, which runs you $4.55. And then once again, to spray your miniatures with that matte varnish, you'll need to buy Munitorium Varnish, runs you $19.50. So once again, assuming that you're purchasing all of these products from Army Painter as well as Games Workshop for the very first time to paint your miniatures the same way we did using cheap stuff, you will need to have a grand total investment of $248.55. Just to give you guys an idea of how much that is, you could literally buy a brand new box set of Cursed City by Games Workshop from Amazon for that price, or from eBay for that price, right? Nearly $250 worth of money just to paint up your miniatures. Now, we're talking about spending $248.55 to paint up a team that costs you anywhere between $30 to $40. It's insane, okay? So because of that, when you compare that with the Cheapskate method, our Cheapskate method costs you $45.31. You're talking about a grand total savings of $203.24. So if you're looking for a way to save money on your miniatures wargaming and you paint your miniatures, might I suggest you take the Cheapskate method of doing it, because it's going to save you substantial amounts of money in order to paint up your team that way. So keep that in mind. When you're running into a situation where the paint you're purchasing actually outweighs the cost of the team, you might want to reanalyze some of the things that you're doing. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest, greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's going to do it for this video, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.